Greetings, fellow students of art. This is about the traffic light in psychology, biology, science fiction, Tibetan Buddhism, history, and in contemporary art and art theory. To better understand what is going on with this other-than-human character in David Lynch and Marsh Frost's television show Twin Peaks. The Twin Peaks traffic light, it's iconic. It shows up twice in the pilot, all throughout seasons 1 and 2, and the film Fire Walk With Me, and now it appears and echoes beautifully across The Return, season 3, from one end to another. For example, the different colored Rancho Rosa intros look like traffic lights, and there's clearly a yellow light for part 3, which is when we get Dougie, and everything slows way down, a red light for part 9, and then a green light for part 16, when we get Cooper back and can finally go. And we accelerate into what looks like darkness, if this is a kind of storyboard. Let me ask you, why do you think part 9 is red? I'd love to hear what you think. Please share your ideas in the comments. If you blur your eyes, the lights look like mushroom clouds. And traffic lights did play a real-life role in the creation of the Trinity bomb, and I'll talk about that later, but first, let's look at how the signal echoes and refracts in other ways. A green light flashes onto Anthony's face in part 5. The evolution of the arm kind of looks like a traffic light, especially when it's yelling, go now, from atop its tree in part 2. And isn't its doppelganger yellow? It changes from red or pink to yellow, out of a frozen statue. And a woodsman acts like a traffic light in the floral wallpaper room in part 15. When he moves from one position to another to let Mr. C go through to the Dutchman's, he's directing traffic. And in a sense, Bobby Briggs in part 11, also a traffic light. He's the receiving end of that woman screaming from her car to let her go through. And let's not forget another one of my favorite scenes from The Return, also in part 2, a scene that one critic called a great echo of the original traffic light scene, turned into a rattling, noisy hell beast. This is when we wait at that blinking railroad crossing light, and we can hear the train screaming in our ears long before we ever see it. A metaphor for the show itself? It's not until part 6 of The Return that the original traffic light from the pilot properly returns. And there's this moment of like, holy shit, the traffic light's back. This is it. Here we go. And it's green. And then it turns to yellow and red. And then we see Mike in the red room. Ooh. And then in the next scene, when Cooper is working on his case files, his yellow pencil turns red due to a continuity error. And thank you, Redditors, I Am Dead Yet I Live, and Kale Vico for that one. In art, we honor errors as hidden intentions. And I wonder if Dwayne Dunham, for fun, edited in the traffic light at the beginning of that scene to draw attention to the error. Also in Twin Peaks, there are intentional continuity errors. Tangentially, Richard Horne's car is both red and green, which has got to mean something, and John Bernardi thinks it suggests the story is going through him, Richard. Finally, in Laura Palmer or Carrie Page's house in part 18, an isolated picture on the wall resembles a traffic light, and just in case we weren't paying attention, right beneath it are 3 stacks of toilet paper, 3 teepees. Laura and Bobby used to call Twin Peaks teepee in the diary, as a joke. This all seems very deliberate, especially when we consider that there are echoes of all our favorite Twin Peaks symbols in and around this woman's house in Odessa. We're going to see a real traffic light again, shortly after this scene, when Cooper and Laura, or Richard and Carrie, enter Twin Peaks, and as Kyle from Wrapped In Podcast pointed out, the light changes from red to green just in time so they don't have to slow down. Is it some kind of weird joke? In the pilot, season 1 pilot, the traffic light appears next to its cousin, the ceiling fan. Another signal from above. This one telling Leland, you can go in now. At the beginning of season 2, When Cooper lays it all out at the sheriff's station, it's superimposed over images of donuts. Yum. And a few episodes later, it fades into Maddie's head when she's looking at Laura's homecoming picture and talking with Leland. Is it marking her for death? I'm getting these still shots from Stephen Miller's blog, Setting the Stage. I usually start my research with Miller. And he points out that one of the reasons the light is emblematic of the show itself, like the homecoming picture and coffee and donuts, is because it appeared on promotional materials and VHS cases in the 1990s. And hell, if I didn't know any better, just looking at these cases, I'd think it was the star of the show. Maybe it is. But it's also hanging out at the beginning of the original 1988 script, framing the story, setting the stage. Greg Olson in Beautiful Dark points out that it was Frost who came up with the traffic light scenes in the pilot, probably as a nod to Lynch's use of them in Blue Velvet. Why do you think they like the image so much? It could have something to do with the children's game, Red Light, Green Light, also known as Statues. It's been around for over 100 years. It's everywhere. It's foundational, fundamental, and it's a thrilling game. And as philosopher Roland Barthes famously pointed out, children's games prefigure the world, like toys. And both Lynch and Frost had a lot of experience with this game, and also probably with the Red Light, Green Light milk drinking game featured on the television show Cartoon Express that ran from 1954 to 1966, and its creator and host, Engineer Bill, won 2 Emmy Awards for this thing. Kids at home, they could compete and win against the host on television. It was so interactive. And interestingly, William Stula, or Bill, the engineer, is often pictured with a clock and with a clown. The point is that historically, traffic lights extend beyond the street. They even reach into the bomb. Legend has it, Leo Szilard, the mind behind the bomb, got his idea for a nuclear reactor by watching a traffic light change from red to green. This is also when he says he saw a time crack open. Did traffic lights help give birth to the bomb? Did they spark the revelation in Szilard? Zillard's nuclear reactor does kind of look like a traffic light, and a Rancho Rosa intro, and a cherry pie. They're within us too. Neurobiologists insist there's a traffic light in the brain and a traffic light approach to understanding the brain. So of course our traffic light brains manufactured traffic lights, and now we're involved in a sort of feedback loop. Our eyes also have 3 cones that can pick up 3 colored wavelengths, red, green, and blue, which is apparently the reason why traffic lights use 3 lights. Red has the longest wavelength we can see, and it can be seen the farthest away, and this gives trains and later cars more time to stop on foggy nights. We also use traffic light metaphors. They're metaphors we live by in film production, sports, sexual harassment, eating, dieting, and childhood sexuality. So we can see that they're influencing how we think about a lot of things. And when we sit with them, they induce boredom, which has its own physical and psychological benefits, actually. And weirdly, red lights induce scratching, according to psychodermatology and what's called the traffic light phenomenon. They also kill people. The very first one exploded and killed the police officer who was operating it. And when the automated ones that we all know and love were first invented and installed in US cities in the early 1920s, people were a little scared of them. They thought they were dangerous, even evil, for a number of reasons. First, because people were still dying beneath them. So they didn't really solve that problem very well. Also, they had a more basic impact on civility. And I'm getting this from Megan Kate Nelson's brief history of the stoplight. Drivers didn't have to acknowledge other people at intersections anymore. The stoplight decided everything. And so the once daily experience of publicly connecting with other human beings turned into a private moment to just sit alone, lost in thought. So they're antisocial, and encourage isolation and alienation. And these machines also quickly became what philosophers Bruno Latour and Michel Serres call quasi-objects, or objects with a lot of agency, and what Timothy Morton calls world-encircling hyper-objects, and what William Irwin Thompson calls the next alphas, enunciating the next level of order. And that's one definition of evil, the enunciation of the next level of order. Marshall McLuhan would say that they're examples of a tool we shaped that now shapes us. Nelson writes that traffic lights shaped our cities and sparked our love affair with the car itself. And in a sense, the lights are extensions of our cities and our brains, our eyes, especially with their cameras, our hearts, our insurance agencies, our games. And every extension requires an amputation, as McLuhan says, or every new technology requires a sacrifice. And so we got to wonder, what do we lose? What do we give up for these things? I think it's clear that these American panoptic light machines installed all over the world keep everyone in control. They choreograph dangerous sights from above and partake in making both more dangerous. After they were installed, drivers became more anxious, and it quickly became apparent that the lights produced an increase in road rage. And I'm getting this from A Phenomenology of Traffic in Ho Chi Minh City by Glenn Wyatt. And we know how they felt. We feel it too. People get frustrated when they have to wait at red lights, and so naturally yellow and green lights encourage speed. And this makes accidents more fatal. It makes sense why some critics would call these new devices that encourage speed, quote, the most destructive machines yet to be devised by man, end quote. And in what we now call the United States, about 20% of accidents occur at these things. Nearly 165,000 accidents happen every year because of people running red lights. About 1,000 people a year are killed in the United States from red light running. Are the lights partially to blame? If they're alphas, they're predators. Michael Garfield explains that we humans are haunted by all the predators that used to hunt us. Now they haunt us from inside of modern life. And it's not just a coincidence that road rage, speeding cars, and car accidents are all recurring motifs in horror films, especially David Lynch's horror films. But what I love about Lynch and Frost is they point the camera at the car, but also at the stoplight. And Twin Peaks scholar Jeffrey Weinstock calls them demonic objects and says that they're viewed next to the owls and the swaying branches. And it's kind of interesting. They do look like owls perched up there, and they sway like the branches. But they're also witnesses to the crime. It's like they all saw something that night and are implicated in some way. And with this in mind, it's kind of spooky, but the final episode of The Traffic Light in the pilot is sandwiched between a shot of the log on the beach where Laura's body was found, the ceiling fan, and Sarah Palmer on the couch. What's in our house now? What do we let into our lives? Emerson warned us that when we discard our angels, archangels take their place. I find it interesting that to combat this invading traffic light technology, some neighborhoods are retrieving what's called shared spaces, or places where the sidewalk doesn't end. Open roundabouts where everyone, drivers, pedestrians, cyclists, can all safely coexist. And these angelic spaces are proving that the absence of traffic signs makes everyone more cautious. And maybe we should all revert to what's called magical roundabouts and read Eyal Weizman's famous book, The Roundabout Revolutions. It turns out the same increase in caution happens whenever the power goes out. Like in part 18. People slow down, look alive, fewer people die. And it doesn't actually slow down traffic that much. Okay, so interesting fact, there is no traffic light at the filming location for Sparkwood and 21, which means it was added to the scene on purpose. Let's move on from traffic light history to traffic light art Something happens when an elusive world-encircling hyper-object, usually pushed into the background ubiquity, gets moved into the spotlight. It's like a new gestalt forms. Generally, when we turn any part of our environment into art, we reframe ourselves too, and shift into a wider, deeper perspective, what philosophers call decentered consciousness. We can become sensitive to new environments and can catch new ideas. It's again, as Marshall McLuhan says, the previous environment becomes a work of art in the new, invisible environment, and we can approach traffic lights as ready-made art objects, sort of like the golden shovel, strange tools, and due to the inevitable rise in self-driving car technology, the lights are soon to be negated yet preserved hyper-art Thomasons. And thank you, Eli Fair, for that one. Hyper-art Thomasons, which is to say, they're going to be treated as potted plants. It's also, as William Irwin Thompson says, that we kill with technology and save the victim with art. Anyway, when we approach everyday things as art or as just complex magical entities in and of themselves, it's real easy to flip our perspective, decenter the human, and see material agency and actor networks and buildings breathe people through pathways regulated by stoplights. This alien eye view is captured beautifully here by Ron Frick in his 1992 film, Baraka. And he cuts to the Butoh dancer. I also really like the work of artist geographer Bill Posaras, who talks about the practical and poetic levels of a traffic light that invite us to see it as part of a larger art installation. And another artist who can help us see whole traffic light environments is Hans Optebeek, who builds tiny installations like this one called Location 1, where we walk into the gallery, turn the corner, and are confronted by a dark, foggy intersection. And due to the shift in scale, we're positioned in a bird's eye view, about traffic light level. Inside is now outside, and the edges of the artwork and the viewer disappear in the foggy darkness. Silent stillness surrounds the only activity, the switching on and off of lights, as signals. They pulsate, and they reflect in the tiny fake puddles. The whole image feels allegorical and sacred, like a painting. And this helps me appreciate how in Twin Peaks the tiny lights draw attention to the empty spaces around them. There's a figure ground reversal. And J.P. Tellid, in his 1995 essay, The Disorder of Things in Twin Peaks, uses Foucault's idea of blank spaces and surveillance to better understand what the light is doing in the show and in us. William Irwin Thompson talks more generally about the mind being like a flashlight in search of the nature of darkness, which is all around. The more it searches, the more it chases it away. And if we want to see the nature of what's going on, we have to shift from a creative mode to a receptive mode. We have to turn off the mind and allow the darkness to communicate with us. Thompson talks about this in his book, Time Falling Bodies Take to Light. Another work of art that can help us understand the significance of the traffic light, especially in the United States, is this 1992 painting by Ojibwe artist Carl Beam called Columbus Chronicles. 1992. It was a big year for indigenous art all over the world, as it was the Columbian Quincentenary. And there was a lot of indigenous activism in art as a reaction to all the celebrations this year. 1992. And Twin Peaks is an interesting footnote to this Robert Rauschenberg-esque painting. In the upper left corner, the word Hiroshima is stenciled in white letters over the famous picture of Hiroshima City after the bombing. In the opposite corner, the bottom right, is a traffic light with the red light on. In the center is what looks like a $5 bill, so Abraham Lincoln. But no, it's not him. It's Running Antelope. Hunkpapa Lakota Chief Running Antelope on the 1899 $5 silver note, wearing the completely wrong style of headdress. And on top of all of this weird imagery mined from our collective memory is splattered white paint, titanium white. It's the most popular paint in the world. Look around you right now. You'll see some titanium white. It's everywhere. And the The splattering is akin to the white silhouette of the mushroom cloud painted behind the stairs in the floral wallpaper space. And the drips are bridging the gap between pop art and abstract expressionism. Another artist who elevates traffic light imagery is Colombian sculptor Edgar Negret. In fact, most of Negret's sculptures are remixed versions of traffic lights, and he calls them magical machines, masks, or here, a kachina. Now, kachinas are popular symbols for Native America, like dream catchers, arrowheads, and the flute-playing Cocopelli. They've become stereotypes and collector's items, but they're also very real, living Pueblo spirits. Or I like the term metapersons, defined as other than human persons with greater than human powers. They're metapersons, or they're holy people from the Southwest who sometimes take the form of human dancers, and other times as dolls, carved out of sacred cottonwood root. Numinous dolls who are avatars or indices of the dancers, who are themselves avatars of the local gods, who are themselves avatars of the deeper mysteries and forces. And I wonder if Negret, who also calls them miracles, and compares the very first ones that he ever saw in New York City when he was visiting to Greek gods, I wonder if he thinks that these American-made machines are comparable to, or even the evil doppelgangers of, indigenous metapersons from New Mexico. Posaris also calls the traffic lights, quote, the frozen incarnation of Hermes' god, messengers and indicators of the transient, end quote. And can we think about Twin Peaks in a similar way, as a frozen incarnation of a god, or as the messenger and indicator of the transient? Why does the traffic light inspire such big ideas in all these different disciplines? Posaris explains that due to their design, traffic lights naturally become, quote, poetic links for the intellectual mind, triggers of the unnoticed beauty, semicolons bounded to place, but rites of passage for the next to happen, end quote. They're found in this eerie installation by George Siegel called The Red Light. Siegel often creates what some critics call artificial hells of people waiting at traffic signals, and they're ready-made art installations, so everything is real except for the people, who are, well, real plaster casts, or imprints, copies, ghost images. Traffic lights are in a lot of other works too, like the traffic light tree in London, or Lothar Hempel installations, but I don't think any work of art imbues them with as much mystery and significance as Twin Peaks. And in the show and in real life, I want to consider them as sort of Dadaist works of art, sort of like the Golden Shovel, as strange tools, to use philosopher Alva Noé's term for art, and as sacred sites, not only because they represent important places in the story and in the deep map, Sparkwood and 21 and the Double R Diner, but because there is a saying that in small towns they never put up a stoplight until someone gets killed. And if this is true, then stoplights are roadside memorials. And here we see, again, Twin Peaks foregrounding who's missing, or that something's missing. Then again, these expensive machines are installed in small towns regardless of need all the time because of another saying that it's embarrassing to be a one-stoplight town. And Twin Peaks probably has this small town syndrome. In a sense, they're symbols of the unnecessary, the wasted. Always signaling, floating above us like planets, apertures, eyeballs, oculi. Cooper in Part 2 opens the curtains of the Red Room and sees a highway from the perspective of a traffic light. Are these devices how the aliens peek in on us? We know that one of their lodges is right above ours, at traffic light level. For fun, my theory is that the traffic light that appears in the pilot before it transitions into Eileen Hayward's wheelchair is a person, like the log, or the ring. It's a person, all right. Or it's where someone lives, like Philip Jeffries. Or it could also be an extension of someone, and if this is the case, then it's probably the arm. Go now. The arm seems to be able to travel through electricity. The number 6 telephone pole could be its gateway. And it controls how people get in and out of the Red Room. A red gatekeeper. Interestingly, the pole that supports the traffic light head or signal stack is called the arm. in real life. And they used to be controlled manually. And now that I think about it, maybe it's what the electrician's been doing this whole time. He's an old school policeman wizard who extends into the lights through his cane. And his job, that was decided at the meeting above the convenience store, is to control the traffic lights. And he looks up, this interdimensional being looks up and says, "Animal life." But who knows? Maybe whoever controls the traffic lights controls the town, controls the game, controls who runs into whom, and who can get away. And I'm probably thinking this because hacking traffic lights is one of my favorite television tropes. It's used to show off someone's skills. Think about Mr. C hacking the prison, but also to help the hacker and their buddies get away. I guess some people claim that their bodies affect the traffic lights. They experience street light interference phenomenon, or what's known as high voltage syndrome. We do have a subtle bioelectric charge, and maybe even a sense of being stared at. But I think perceiving or just dreaming of this ability relates to our experience with the buttons installed at intersections that actually do give us this power, or appear to. Most of them don't work anymore and are called placebo buttons. More hyperart Thomasons. Even if they don't work, they work by giving us the illusion of control. What I'm trying to say is that the traffic light in Twin Peaks is framed to suggest it's a character in the show involved in the plot. And Lynch and Frost, they don't have to tell us the whole story. They introduce a panoply of interesting characters and spaces, some of them other than human. They line them up in the imagination, suggest certain relationships and rules, and then let us take it from there. It's a receptive and creative experience, like a game and a dream. And there is a way that the traffic light is a person, place, and thing, and sacred site, and maybe somebody else too. I like to think that it's somebody else, but a popular fan theory, and it's a good one, is that the lights are all part of Laura's elaborate dream world. And for some reason, it's burned into her bardo as a blue key is burned into Diane Selwyn's bardo. Or maybe this ominous machine hanging there, lynched, it is about the size of a small person, is seared into her mind because it was a beacon whenever she snuck out of her house to meet Leo and Jacques for sex. And according to the secret diary, she did this a lot. Or maybe it's a beacon because it was the last sign of life or of hope that she saw before she died or disappeared. And maybe she keeps that picture in her living room in Odessa as some kind of dreary reminder. Or she's just paranoid that the lights are watching her like the owls. They probably are. It's also likely that Laura identifies with the traffic light and that it's a color or pattern that Lynch uses to paint her portrait. Because metaphorically, but it's Twin Peaks, so who knows, a part of Laura is trapped in the traffic light. Fred from TwinPeaksGazette.com describes this idea beautifully. Quote, "The stoplight is all alone, and it carries on going through the motions even when there are no people around. Perhaps this reflects Laura's loneliness and her feeling obliged to go through the motions." End quote. Whew. Maybe it foreshadows the end of part 18? Back to starting positions, back to red? But it could also help us understand how Laura feels. I think what we do as fans is deep map Twin Peaks, to use William Heatmoon's phrase, and we rotate this deep map in our imaginations to look at the story through different angles, to see what happens when we start to think about Laura through the lens of a traffic light, for example. Or what happens when we think about the entire series through this lens, or when we start to think about ourselves through the lens of a traffic light, especially now that we know that our triune brains are structured in a similar way. We get a different understanding of both. The light becomes, like any Lynchian quasi-object, a framework that brings certain aspects of ourselves and the show into greater focus. And it makes me think of something that the great Lu Ming says, that in Twin Peaks, one idea is often presented visually in multiple ways. There are layers of abstraction. And the stoplight could be Laura, but it could be the show itself. And if it represents the character of the show itself, then Twin Peaks gives us some green and yellow lights, but mostly red lights. It makes us wait. It wants us to wait. The pace of the show, of any good show, probably resembles the pace of a drive. There's some backing up, accelerating, slowing down, stopping, waiting, starting back up again, and there's some letting go. The lights are a signal for a type of consciousness or awareness or experience. Essentially, within the millions of cyclopean stoplights floating above our heads, we've got three conditions in a loop. There are three lights, three bodies, as there are three Coopers. Three Phillips, each assigned to a Cooper. Three Lauras, three seasons, three Bobs, according to the evolution of the arm. Also within the return, we begin and end more or less in the same place. So too, as the Buddhists would say, every person, every 24 hours, experiences three major states of consciousness in a loop: waking, dreaming, and sleeping. Three great states available to everyone, even babies. You're mostly in just one at a time. In this case, the waking state, with the others pushed into the background, but they're still there, as are their signature brainwave patterns. Can you feel them back there? See them? Near the horizon or near the margins? As William James put it 100 years ago, our normal waking consciousness is but one special type of consciousness, while all around it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, are other kinds of consciousness. And at night we fall out of our waking state and start orbiting the dreaming and sleeping states, with waking consciousness now waiting just outside the horizon. Chaos mathematician Alan Combs thinks states of consciousness should be conceptualized as chaotic attractors, because whenever we change states, when we fall asleep, for example, or more accurately, when the sleep state begins to overtake us, we drift off as if carried away toward a new attractor basin. However it happens, the Buddhists point out that falling asleep is also waking up to these other subtle states of consciousness, if you can stay lucid. And I hope you don't mind if I indulge, but Cooper is a Tibetan dream yogi, and in that system, each of the three great states corresponds with a dream world or realm. So waking, dreaming, and sleeping states correlate with gross, subtle, and causal realms. Eastern philosophers also talk about how this spectrum of consciousness is supported by a spectrum of energy that runs from gross physical energy, the heaviest, to a more subtle or etheric mental energy, psychic energy, to causal energy. And these energies are also known as bodies or sheaths, according to Indian philosophy, because every mind has a body, and every body-mind has a realm. So, just like Dale Cooper, we all have three minds, three bodies, and three realms. We're a whole damn town. And next to all these, there's a popular Tibetan Buddhist practice called Ahum, which imagines the three bodies and energies as three colors and sounds stacked on top of each other, going on and off like a traffic light. And I posted instructions to this Tibetan traffic light meditation that Cooper probably practices to 25 years later if you're interested. And there you'll find a lot of links and citations and more research. But just a quick warning, according to the teachers, these Maha mantras, the Om, Ah, and Hum, summon very refined impulses of creative intelligence, sometimes referred to as angels and devas, so look out. Also, if you take the time to imagine tiny versions of your favorite metapersons or entities floating inside of your body as the sources of the lights and mantras, they're more likely going to show up, and their qualities are more likely going to manifest, evidently. I should also mention that in the Tibetan Dzogchen tradition, this particular stoplight meditation provides preparation for realization at the time of death, which essentially involves a process of dropping through a spectrum of colored worlds, from white, then down to red, the longest wavelength, and then rapidly down through to dark blue, black, and then clear light. I also posted more about that on 25 years later. So, the traffic light, it's not simply a location in space, but also a vehicle in time that can accelerate the evolution of consciousness. maybe even set us face to face with the clear light, like Dale Cooper does for Leland Palmer in season 2. But even without knowing anything about esoteric Tibetan Buddhist practices, every day, that boring minute waiting at a light can become a moment for watching the eye get lost in dreams. Got a light? They hold a mystical, almost koan-like potential when considered in this way. They're openings, and they reflect qualities of the human condition, qualities that apparently include glowing totemic signal stacks, turning on and off. Okay, my conclusions. These manufactured entities are alive and in control. They influence non-driving behavior too. They even co-founded the Manhattan Project, holy shit. And they're part of a team of meta-persons meeting behind the curtains, conjuring the features of our world. Also, enough people have died, lives ruined, and property damaged. The traffic lights are comparable to bombs and demons. We can also see how traffic lights are a positive way into a decentered consciousness and a post-human hyperobject actor network mindset that's decolonizing, because turning objects into people is the opposite of what colonialism does. They're also good containers for understanding Laura, for visualizing season 3 as a whole, and they help us think about an ever-changing 3-tiered signal stack of dream states happening inside all of us all the time. And for more about that, check out Christina Spencer's new article on 25 Years Later about chakra imagery in The Return. It's worth a look. Finally, like any religious text, if it's a good one, Twin Peaks is itself an eternal stoplight, a space and time for probing and synthesizing, waiting and accelerating. It's always there, available to us. And it asks that we consider inert objects as significant actors, and that we take inventory of the dead things in our world too, because they have special agency. Maybe the most obvious example of this is a traffic light, something that literally directs people like a film director. All right, that's it. Thank you all so much for your attention. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the traffic light or anything related. Let's think out loud. Please post a comment, and remember, you're dreaming.